Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a tag video. This is the DNF tag. DNF standing for Did Not Finish. i.e. are you a bailer like Sean the Book Maniac, or are you an anal retentive, which is probably like me. But let's get to the prompts. This was originated by Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and I will post the link to that. I originally saw it on Brian at Bookages. I haven't been directly tagged, but I quite fancy this one. So, prompt 1, do you DNF? Well, to give you an idea, I have DNF'd 3 books in the last 4 years. One was Link by Steve Aylett this year. One was a Joseph McElroy book, my first one of his. I know he's highly regarded in the sort of experimental wing, but I didn't get on with that. And the third was Nicola Barker's Cauliflower. And I didn't finish them all for the same reason, which was they were boring. And normally I have this rather perverse belief that a book always has something redeemable about it. That's why I always plough on to the end, more, you know, in the vast amount of cases. So even books that I've ended up not liking, such as this one, Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, there were 2 reasons that I finished this. One, it's very short, so it really was no great sacrifice, 150 pages. And secondly, I was getting a perverse pleasure out of being annoyed by some of the idiocy I found within it. So it wasn't boring. It wasn't very good, but it wasn't very boring. And as a writer, it enables me also to hone my this works, that doesn't work kind of analysis. So a book like that, even though I gave it 1 star or 2 stars, I would still see as a worthwhile read for me, and not to be did not finish. But as I say, those 3 that I gave up on in the last 4 years were just too boring to plough on. They were, you know, Link was not a bad book. I could see what he was trying to do. It's a sort of fake biography of a sort of pulp filmmaker, sci-fi filmmaker, sort of B-movie filmmaker. But it's not a world I'm very interested in, and I just found it dull, and I didn't want to plough on with it. So on the whole, my answer is no, I tend not to DNF, but occasionally I do. Question 2, if you DNF a book, does it count towards the books read for the month? Well, I'm afraid it does, for 2 reasons. One, there are so few that I don't think it really distorts my reading figures. And 2, because I use the book reads thing to keep a tally of what I have read. When you start a book, obviously it moves from want to read to currently reading, and then to get it off currently reading, you have to put, you know, read. And I will put in the notes DNF of my review. But that means it does get counted. So is it dishonest? As I say, it happens so rarely, I don't see it as a major issue for me. 3, is there a difference between DNF and putting down for a bit? Now, this is a really interesting question to me, because apart from those 3 books I've just mentioned, I have a lot of books that have just put down with the good intention that I will go back to them. And if we go mobile for a bit, I'll give you an example. So this is my desk currently. So on the top we have Clarice Lispector, which I started. This is the Chandelier, which came out last November. I started this late spring, and I'm definitely going to go back to it because she's one of my favourite authors. You have to be in the mood to read Lispector, and I think with the COVID virus I haven't quite had the intensity. Duck's New Report, which I started last December, got to 200 pages, then had to put it aside in the new year because I was finishing a deadline. When COVID dropped, I read another 100 pages, taking me up to 300, made good, 100 pages in a week. I was sort of quite pleased with that. But I do have a mental block when it comes to big books, if it stops me reading other stuff at the same time. So I do want to finish this. This is not a DNF by any means. Unlanguage by Michael Sisko. This won't be a DNF either, but I don't know when I'm going to get back to it, because Michael Sisko, as we'll see in another prompt, new author to me. He writes new weird, which I will talk about, but this is not. This is an experimental and a linguistic book, but it's not rooted in anything. It's a complete sort of speculative mind, as I suppose befits Cisco, because that's what he writes his more normal books. So although it's an interesting exercise in sort of playing around with language and linguistics, ultimately it does just remain an exercise, which is a bit unsatisfactory, but I will finish it. Ah, yes, the Oxford Book of Death. So I was reading this, and then COVID dropped, and I stopped reading it because I just sort of stupidly thought in a supernatural way, I don't want to be reading a book about death when death is being enhanced all around us in terms of the numbers. So it's just a superstitious thing. I will read it, I don't know when. James Joyce, Ulysses. Well, I will definitely be getting back to this because we were doing a group read. Again, COVID hit. None of us felt we could devote the intensity of mind and concentration you need for this. So we stopped the buddy read. But, you know, A, I'm enjoying it. B, I do want to finish it because, you know, I've never read it before. And it's just, again, sort of finding the momentum. But here's a different one. This is Joy Williams, The Quick and the Dead, which I started reading last year. Boring. Falls into a similar category with Link and the other two I mentioned. So I probably won't finish this, but it is still sat on my desk in the vain hope, I suppose, that it will be read to completion. So this is what I mean. Most books I put aside, I am been recently reading, so there's no real issue. But this has been put aside for quite a long time. I'm going to talk about some others as well. So this probably will be a DNF. And finally, Mark Danielewski, Only Revolutions. You know, everyone's read House of Leaves, but has anyone else has you read any other Danielewski? Which is why I picked this up. I've read 100 pages of it. It's 300 pages or 160 pages. It's very interesting, but it's all of one note. Once you get the concept, I'm not sure there's much more to be added. So I ran out of sort of enthusiasm for it, but I will finish it. Again, I'm just not sure when. Some of these will be obvious, you know, when COVID lifts, if it ever lifts, like the Oxford Book of Death. I'll be happily to get back to that. But others of these, it's not clear when I'm going to get back to them, including Ducks Newburyport. The Chandelier, I think, will be the one of all of those that I will pick up again the quickest. But then we have some other categories of older put aside for, you know, we'll pick up again later. And I want to mention 4 of those. The Piano Teacher by Elfriede Jelinek. Quicksilver by Neil Stevenson, The Sports Writer by Richard Ford, and The Fortress of Solitude by Jonathan Lethem. I put all of those aside, saying I would come back to them, and they were sort of stacked up here, and they got to quite a pile because there were other books as well. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to get back to these immediately or anytime soon, so they're going to go down to the shed. I know where they are, I can go and pick them up when I finally do. I mean, The Sports Writer, for example, was enjoyable. It was just long and a bit dense. And I just sort of fell out of being in the mood of reading it. But what I read, I enjoyed. Quicksilver really wasn't my kind of thing, but I thought I would get back to it. It's historical fiction with a bit of magic thrown in, sort of 2 elements I really don't like. But I like Neil Stevenson. So I assumed and it was well written, what I read. So I thought, well, I'm not going to dispose of this. I'll put it out into the shed. The Fortress of Solitude is the only Jonathan Lethem book that I haven't really got on with. It's very dense, it's very stodgy, it's very slow. It was his debut book. So I have all my other Lethems here inside the house with me, but that one I took outside into the shed, thinking, well, you know, one day I will get back to it. Now, The Piano Teacher is slightly different because I'd like to talk about a Roman Polanski film here called Repulsion, starring Catherine Deneuve. I've tried to sit down to watch that film on 3 different occasions, and each time never got past the same point, where Deneuve has killed the bloke, spoiler alerts, and then she has some sort of physiological reaction to it herself. Bit sort of Crime and Punishment. And I've never been, you know, it is repulsive, but not in a sort of gross gore way. It's in black and white, so it's not that gory. But I just felt sick in my stomach each time and just wasn't able to progress. Now, The Piano Teacher had the same effect. Now, I've only tried to read The Piano Teacher once, but again, it's about a woman who abases herself sexually towards men, becomes sort of almost a sex slave, and I just didn't get on with it. but it evoked very similar reaction in me to the Polanski film. Anyway, so that went out to the shed with the others. So they were all sort of happily moved out of here to make more room for books that I did want to read, with the sort of good intention that I would get back to reading them one day. And then my mould outbreak struck, and all 4 of those were victims. Particularly annoying in the case of the Lethem, because now I'm no longer a completist, although I don't think you can ever be a completist, Lethem, because he's written so many books. But particularly annoying in the case of Quicksilver, because I had said to Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, when he visited London a couple of years ago and we met up, I said I'd happily lend it to him because I couldn't see myself getting back to reading it. And when we met up, I'd forgotten to bring it with me. So I had the intention of sending it out to him, but it got caught up in my mould outbreak, so it's gone, it's dead, I'm afraid, as all of those books are. I don't regret losing The Piano Teacher, I don't regret losing The Fortress of Solitude, I do regret losing The Sports Writer, because I think I would have got back to that. And as for Quicksilver, well, I don't regret it personally, but I regret the fact that I couldn't send it to a better home with Jason. So, is there a difference between DNF and putting it down just for a bit? In theory, yes. With external force majeure, acts of God like mould outbreaks, no. It's as if I disposed of it. Yeah, it's a tricky one to define, really. I think, as I say, the books I mainly showed you on my desk have all been recently picked up and started, and will all be returned to. So they're definitely did not finish. They're all in my currently reading in Goodreads. But the issue is, when will they be returned to? Some will this year, some will be finished this year, but will all of them? Can't honestly say that will be the case. What popular book have you DNF'd? Well, there's so few books that I haven't finished. I'm not sure I can answer this. I think The Sports Writer is a pretty popular book. But no, I don't really have an answer for that. What book do you wish you had DNF'd? Well, I've got several for this. Hurricane Season by Fernando Melchior, longlisted for the Booker International this year, and very, quite loved on BookTube. But funnily enough, of all the reviews I've done on Goodreads, this has had more uptick and likes from people, because I think they feel like me that, everyone's supposed to love this book, but actually it's quite possible not to get on with it at all, because it's one tone and that tone is shrill. And I ploughed on to the end hoping there'd be some sort of resolution, but no, it's shrill all the way through. And so I really didn't like that. I read this, Michael Sisko's, I talked about on language. When I picked this up, I didn't realise it was New Weird. So New Weird is that sort of urban fantasy with sort of the equivalent of magical realism, although it's not magical realism. It's sort of great imaginative leaps of logic where certain things in our world, it's a sort of futuristic version of steampunk, if that makes any sense. And I don't like the genre, but the reason I don't like the genre is how the genre is executed, because I found this with this book and I found it with China Miéville, that they throw these amazing ideas and inventions at you, but it's so prosaically delivered. It's like, there was this, there was that. These things should be mind-blowing. They should make the reader stop and go, wow, what an imaginative leap that entails. But no, because they're on to the next one. They just pack their books with all these strange and wonderful things and don't let the reader have any breathing space to appreciate them. And they may be magical or supernatural, but they're treated as if they're normal, because that's the world that's why I say it's like sort of a futuristic steampunk. And it drives me potty. I mean, for all the invention, it's just, again, it's a bit like this. It's sort of one tone, one pitch. So I wish I hadn't finished that. But that's my own fault for not doing my research properly. Then I read this 3 years ago, Paul Auster's 4321, which is different versions of the same New England boy's life. And it's basically, I read it as Paul Auster, sort of, thinking about, alternative tracks that his own life could have taken. And I just wanted to smack the character around the face, because he's so sort of middle class and indulged and privileged. And I didn't really care about his little dilemmas that sent him down different paths, because it all seemed terribly self-obsessed, and you know, it's a big chunky book. It's 850 pages, and I plough through it, and I just wish I hadn't really. So yeah, I regret reading that one all the way through. Do you ever attempt to reread a DNF? Has this ever been successful for you? I can't think of an occasion where I have, except possibly Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, which is a non-fiction book about black holes and time and cosmology. I first read it, and now this is scratching back in my memory. I don't think I quite finished it. I think I got ground down and stopped at the point where he introduced string theory. So I don't think I finished it. But I picked it up again 6 years later and got through it and loved it, and even understood the bits about string theory. So I think that's possibly the only occasion where I have gone back to a DNF. I'm not a great rereader anyway, and I limit myself to 2 rereads a year, and that means I'm only going to reread stuff that has blown my mind. I'm not going to go back and read DNFs. What do you do with books you DNF? Well, as I said, there was a natural cull called mould and mildew. Books that are banished to my shed are just sort of the lower caste books in my collection. I don't wish any harm on them, but I had a mould and mildew outbreak which did cull about 500 books, including that bunch of DNFs that I'd only recently taken down there. So I wouldn't necessarily throw a DNF out if I really wanted to get a book out of my sight. And a book such as this I so disliked, but I still want it in my collection. I think rather fondly of this book because of my critique of it. So yeah, I wouldn't really get rid of them, and if I did, I'd give them away to other people or charity shops. Do you choose more or less risky because of your stance on DNF? Well, it's not relevant because I DNF too few books for it to influence any notion of risk. I'm not sure how one judges a risky read anyway. Is it a risky read because it's off the main beaten track of literature, which is what the stuff I read anyway, so it's not a risk to me, whereas it might be to other people. In a way, it's more risky for me to pick up a popular book, because more often than not I'm going to get disappointed because it is so, bromide. So no, DNF doesn't factor into my judgment of risk, and my judgment of risk is inverted from most people's anyway. And tag 5 BookTube Buddies, or however many people you want. I'm just going to throw it open to everyone because I'm quite late to this, having seen it on other people's channels. So yeah, there you have it. That is my approach to DNF. Yeah, a minefield if you actually stop to think about it. I think in a way I was perversely saved by that mould outbreak, because otherwise I'd have a lot more DNFs. But books which I'd always hadn't admitted myself were DNFs, I'd said, oh, I'll go back to them. But it had been long enough, in some cases 8 years. I think if you don't go back to a book in 8 years, that probably rates as a DNF, and you're just deluding yourself otherwise. Okay, so till next time, thanks very much.